Hello, welcome to lesson 15.6A. I've entitled this video, On the Brink of Disaster. This video is going to cover pages 936 to 939. Kennedy, Johnson, and Vietnam. The presidential election of 1960 pitted Republican Vice President Richard Nixon against John F. Kennedy, a Democrat and senator from Massachusetts. It was a close contest that went to Kennedy by a narrow margin. And you can see just how narrow that margin is. Look at this electoral vote, 49.7, popular vote, 49.7 to 49.6. Look at that. A couple 100,000 votes is all that determined the popular vote winner. In the Electoral College, you notice it's much different. It looks bigger, but that's how our Electoral College works. It can skew a little bit the results of the popular vote, but you can see this was a very, very close election. So question number one, who were the two candidates competing in the 1960 presidential election? For the Republicans, you had the Vice President for Eisenhower, Richard Nixon. And for the Democrats, you had the senator from Massachusetts named John F. Kennedy. A new president. Many Americans voted against John F. Kennedy because they felt he did not have enough experience to be president. Others worried about Kennedy's religion, Catholicism. No Roman Catholic had ever been president. Many Americans feared that Kennedy might be more loyal to the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church than to the country. Kennedy reassured voters that he believed in the separation of church and state. Question number two. What were two factors that cost John F. Kennedy some votes in the presidential election in 1960? Well, number one, some people felt like he lacked enough experience to be president. And secondly, they were worried about his religion. We had never had a Roman Catholic before. Which answers question three. What type of person had America never had as president? A person who had been a Roman Catholic, a faith follower. Question four. What was the main concern the Americans had about Kennedy being a Roman Catholic? Well, they feared that he might be more loyal to the Pope and to the church than to the country. Question five. When Kennedy told voters he believed in the separation of church and state, what did he mean by this statement? What he meant is he could separate religion from politics, which is why I have these political cartoons here. They are supposed to be separate. We are not supposed to be mixing government and religion. Now, what we're supposed to be doing and what actually happens are sometimes two separate things. Television helps Kennedy win. The Kennedy-Nixon race included the first televised presidential debates in history. They turned the tide for Kennedy. It was a close race, with Nixon holding the advantage through much of the summer. But on the day of the first debate, Nixon was recovering from the flu. Plus, he spent the day campaigning while Kennedy holed up in a hotel and practiced for the debate. When the two men appeared on stage, Kennedy appeared youthful and confident, in contrast with Nixon, who looked tired and nervous. Question six. What happened for the first time in the presidential election in 1960? A televised presidential debate occurred. Question seven. Prior to the first television debate, how was the race looking? Well, it was very close, but Nixon was actually in the lead, according to polls. Question eight. Contrast how Kennedy and Nixon handled the debate and how their physical appearance affected the debate. Well, you had a couple things here. Number one, on the day of the debate, Nixon spent the day campaigning, while Kennedy decided, instead of campaigning, I'm going to practice for the debate in the hotel. So there's something to be said for that. And next, Kennedy appeared youthful and confident. He was not afraid to wear makeup for the television cameras, where Nixon looked tired and nervous because he had been recovering from the flu. Also, he sort of stood differently because he was hurting with his leg, and he did not want to wear the makeup. He didn't think that was very manly to wear makeup for TV. And also, he wore a gray suit, which is hard to tell in the black and white, but the gray suit contrasted with the gray background, made him look pale, where Kennedy wore a darker suit. And that definitely made a difference. It made him pop a little bit more. So just a couple of things that they did differently for the debate. As debaters, the two were evenly matched. Those who listened to the debate on the radio considered it a draw or even gave the edge to Nixon. In contrast, the TV audience rated Kennedy as the clear winner. In November, in one of the closest elections since Reconstruction, Kennedy won the popular vote with a margin of less than 120,000 voters. So question number 9, how did radio listeners differ from those that watched the debate on television? Well, the radio people felt like it was a tie or even that Nixon had won the debate. But on television, because of physical appearances, they gave the nod to Kennedy. And when you go back and look at the polling, they do say that a lot of people actually voted for Kennedy because of the debate, and that probably was the difference in the popular vote, and that helped him win the electoral vote as well. So question number 10, what was the outcome of the election in 1960? Voters slimly elected Kennedy to be president of the United States. And here we see an electoral college map. And as you can see, the country was pretty evenly split with the electoral college. I mean, you had blue in the north, you had blue in the south, you had blue, just only one blue in the west. And then you had a lot of red Nixon Republican votes in the west and spread throughout the east here, a little bit north, a little bit mid, a little south. And then you also had a third party candidate, Byrd, who did get a couple of states. And here we see it broken down by county. I sometimes like these maps a little bit better. It just goes to show you how our country votes. Because if you remember, if you look back here, notice Kennedy won Illinois in its 27 electoral votes. But look at Illinois on this map. It might surprise you, like, wait a minute, most of Illinois is red. Yes, but the places that are blue are like Chicago, which have a lot of people. So but it just goes to show you that Illinois may appear blue on a map many times, but there are actually a lot of Republican counties in Illinois. Kennedy inspires the nation. John F. Kennedy took the presidential oath of office on January 20th, 1961. At 43, he was the youngest man ever elected president and the first to be born in the 20th century. "Let the word go forth," he said, "that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans." Kennedy's youth and idealism had inspired Americans during the campaign. Now he called them to service. And this is a picture of John F. Kennedy and his wife, Jackie. And question number 11, besides his religion, how was John F. Kennedy different from the past presidents? Well, he was the youngest man ever elected president. The youngest president was Teddy Roosevelt, but he took over because of an assassination on McKinley, and he became the youngest president that served. But the youngest man ever elected, that the American people said, yes, we want that person to be president, was John F. Kennedy. And also, he was the first president to be born in the 20th century. So he was born in the 1900s, the very first one that was that. So it just goes to show you that he was a little bit younger than many presidents, that all presidents had been prior to that point. Question number 12. What were two things that many Americans liked about John F. Kennedy? Well, they liked his youth and they liked his idealism. Idealism is that belief that the world can be a better place. Now, we've briefly talked about this in the past, the difference between, Woodrow Wilson was an idealist. The belief that, talking out problems can solve things, people can work together. That contrast against realism, which is that countries basically do what they can to survive. And there's a back and forth in our country with our different political parties about idealism versus realism. Primary source. This is from John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, which we are going to listen to tomorrow in class, but I figure I'll go ahead and read it to you now. I won't do it as well as John F. Kennedy, of course. Primary source. The trumpet summons us again to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle against the common enemy of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And that is question number 13. What is the famous quote that Kennedy's inaugural address gives us as far as our historical record? It's that line. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, which is one of the most iconic moments in any presidential inaugural address of all time. For all his youth and high hopes, Kennedy and the presidents who followed him faced tough challenges. The 1960s and 70s were years of idealism. They also turned out to be a time of uncertainty, tragedy, and turmoil for Americans of all ages, as these 5 leaders' tragic ends to their lives show us. It was a tough time. Why was communist Cuba a threat? By the time Kennedy entered the White House, the United States and the Soviet Union had emerged as superpowers, which are defined as nations with enough military, political, and economic strength to influence events worldwide. As leader of a superpower, President Kennedy was given the task of negotiating the country's way through Cold War crises. In fact, the rivalry between the superpowers led to clashes in many places, including Cuba, an island in the Caribbean very close to the United States. Question number 14. Define superpower. A superpower is a nation with enough military, political, and economic strength to influence events worldwide. In 1959, Fidel Castro, shown right here, led a revolution that set up a communist state in Cuba. Castro's government took over private companies, including many owned by American businesses. Thousands of Cubans, especially those from the upper and middle classes, fled to the United States. So question 15, in 1959, how did the Cold War spill into Cuba? Well, Fidel Castro led a communist revolution there in Cuba. A failed invasion. The Soviet Union began supplying Cuba with large amounts of aid. The growing ties between the Soviet Union and Castro's Cuba worried American officials. Cuba lies just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy approved a plan to support Cuban exiles in an invasion of Cuba to overthrow Castro. Exiles are people who have been forced to leave their own country. A force of about 1,400 Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's south coast. The invasion was badly planned. Castro's forces outnumbered the invaders and quickly rounded them up and jailed them, killing about 100 of the invaders. The Bay of Pigs invasion strengthened Castro in Cuba and embarrassed the United States. So question 16, how did the Soviet Union deal with Cuba and Castro at that time? Well, they began supplying Cuba with large amounts of aid, both in money, financial, and military. Question 17, why were American officials concerned with Soviet influence in Cuba? Well, number one, we were fighting the Cold War, so a spread of communism to any place in the world was something that we were concerned with. But most importantly, Cuba is less than 100 miles away from the United States. So if, let's say, Cuba were to have, atomic bombs, nuclear weapons, they could fire those off from Cuba and they would get to our coast very, very quickly. Question 18. What is an exile? An exile is a person who's been forced to leave their own country. Number 19. Describe the Bay of Pigs invasion. Well, Kennedy planned this military effort, to take exiles from Cuba, to send them to Cuba, and use those forces to oust Castro and then set up a more favorable government for the United States. Well, it was a disaster. It was poorly planned. They were outnumbered. They were quickly rounded up and jailed. Several of them died. About 100 of them died. And it made America look weak. It was embarrassing, and it made Castro and communism look strong. So question number 20, how did the Bay of Pigs invasion turn out for the United States, Cuba, and the Soviet Union? For the United States, horribly. It was embarrassing. For Cuba, it made Castro look strong. And of course, for the Soviet Union, they looked good because they were supporting a Cuban dictator in Castro who was able to defend his homeland from the mighty United States. Here we see a map of the Bay of Pigs invasion. So some of the forces left from Florida, then they went down here to Guatemala, and then they came back up here to the Bay of Pigs. Also, some left Puerto Rico. Here's where the Bay of Pigs invasion took place. Here we see another picture. It just goes to show you how close Cuba is to the United States, less than 100 miles, about 90 miles. Here we see a political cartoon of the Bay of Pigs invasion. We'll talk about this political cartoon tomorrow. If you understand why they used a cigar, then excellent. If not, we'll talk about that tomorrow. And here we see another political cartoon, which we'll talk about again tomorrow. Why do they have this shown? Impending crisis. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Soviet Union gave Cuba more weapons. In October 1962, President Kennedy learned that the Soviets were secretly building missile bases on the island. If the bases were completed, nuclear missiles launched from them could reach American cities within minutes. Kennedy responded cautiously to the Cuban Missile Crisis. He announced that American warships would be positioned around Cuba with orders to stop any Soviet ships carrying missiles. For the next 6 days, the world waited tensely as Soviet ships traveling toward Cuba approached the American blockade. At the last minute, the Soviet ships turned back. "We're eyeball to eyeball," said Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and I think the other fellow just blinked. If we go back, you can see right here, here's where that blockade was set up. So let's answer question number, let's see, where were we at? We are on question number 21. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, what did the Soviet Union do in Cuba? Well, they gave Cuba even more weapons, and then they started to leave on the island some military bases, which would be allowed to be used for nuclear missiles. Question 22. What did Kennedy find out about Cuba in October of 1962? He learned that these missile bases were being built on Cuba. Not good. Question 23. Describe the main events of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, once Kennedy found out about the missile bases being constructed, he said we were going to put warships around Cuba and we were going to stop any Soviet ships from carrying missiles to get through. And then for 6 days, there was this very tense part of the world. In fact, this is considered to be the closest we've ever been to World War III. And people were waiting each day. Are the Soviets going to try to get ships through? Is this going to lead to World War III? Very tense moments. Eventually, the Soviet ships turned back, and the United States and the Soviet Union were able to secretly make an agreement to de-escalate or to calm down the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here we see the picture of what Kennedy was looking at. These were the pictures of the missile bases being constructed. Kennedy's strong stand led the Soviets to compromise. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba. In turn, the United States promised not to invade the island. Still, the crisis had shaken both American and Soviet officials. In all the years of the Cold War, the world had never come closer to a full-scale nuclear war. And we're going to talk about these political cartoons tomorrow. I'm sure some of you can probably already guess what this means and also what this means, if you know anything about Noah and the Ark and the biblical story of Noah's Ark. So now we can answer question 24. How did Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev work out a compromise to end the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, Nikita Khrushchev said, "I will remove the missiles from Cuba." In exchange, the United States promised not to invade the island. And that was the compromise that was needed to de-escalate the Cuban Missile Crisis. 25. What is the significance of the Cuban Missile Crisis during the Cold War? Well, never had we been closer to World War III than that time. It was very scary for the Americans that were alive at that time. Question 26. What was created after the Cuban Missile Crisis to help communication between the United States and the Soviet Union? Well, the proverbial red phone was put in place. Basically, the United States and the Soviet Union put in communication devices where we could have direct communication to the President of the United States and the leader of the Soviet Union. Now, that's changed over time what type of communication device it is. It's not a red phone today, but it still is symbolic of we put in lines of communication so that would never happen again, where we'd be that close to World War III. And here we see another political cartoon, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Well, thank you very much for watching. Since we did talk about the Bay of Pigs invasion, I thought I would use a pig joke to end the video. How do pigs write top secret messages? The answer? With invisible oink. Oh my. Have a nice day.